and today we're diving into a story of intergalactic military exchanges and the unexpected hilarity that can ensue when humans get involved. But before we jump in, make sure you've subscribed. It's free and helps our stories pop up right in your feed as we explore the far reaches of the galaxy. In the vast, sterile halls of the Valonian training complex, few things were more revered than the Bricker, a race known for their ruthlessness in battle and their terrifyingly efficient weaponry. Their arsenal, capable of disintegrating enemies into mere atoms with a single strike, had instilled fear across countless star systems. And yet, there was one thing that struck terror into the Bricker themselves: their newest military exchange program, which included a human cadet. Humanity's reputation in the universe was a mixed bag. While some species feared their unpredictability, others admired their resourcefulness. Richard Maxwell, however, seemed to redefine the entire concept of unpredictability. A human who seemed more inclined to discuss the finer points of Earth beverages than the intricacies of alien weaponry. He was not the military prodigy the Bricker had hoped for, and his lack of enthusiasm was about to challenge everything the Bricker thought they knew about diplomacy. General Evar, the towering Bricker commander, observed Richard with growing frustration. The human cadet, with his messy brown hair and a perpetual smirk that seemed completely out of place in the grim surroundings, walked through the Valonian training complex, his eyes not on the elaborate combat stations or weapon racks, but on the complex architecture of the building itself. It was designed to withstand extreme gravitational fluctuations, with living walls that absorbed energy like a sponge. To Richard, it was just another place. To General Evar, it was a marvel of engineering, the pinnacle of Bricker achievement, and Richard was more interested in the temperature of the water in the nearby training pool. Cadet Maxwell, General Evar's voice boomed, the deep vibrations of his tone making the air hum. You understand, of course, that this exchange was not some random choice. You'll be the first human to train with our elite Bricker troops. The opportunity is an honor. Richard glanced up at the towering Bricker, barely suppressing a yawn. Yeah, sure, sounds great, he said, eyes scanning the walls. But can we talk about the swimming pool for a sec? Evar's sharp exhale sounded like a hiss, and his armor plates tightened visibly, a sign of mounting stress. The pool is not for leisure, Cadet Maxwell. It is a part of your training. The Bricker do not swim for fun. Richard chuckled, clearly unimpressed. Sure, right. I get it. All this tech stuff, weapons, war, you guys have it down. But that pool, I'm just saying, looks like it's got some serious potential. Does it have a temperature setting? The Bricker general's expression froze, his eyes narrowing. Focus, cadet. The weapons we train with here are not to be taken lightly. You will learn how to control them, how to defend yourself with them. You will respect the Bricker way. Yeah, of course, General. Just don't see the point in all the grumpy seriousness around here. Richard's voice trailed off as he absent-mindedly adjusted the strap on his backpack. His disinterest was palpable, and General Evar's frustration bubbled under the surface. They moved through the complex, entering a massive training dome where the Bricker were preparing for their next exercise. The walls were reinforced with layers of nanofiber mesh, designed to absorb any energy released during combat training. Richard's eyes lit up when he noticed the massive holographic display at the center of the room. Is that a targeting system? He asked, pointing at the holograms of alien combatants materializing and dissolving in the air. General Evar nodded stiffly, though his body tensed in obvious discomfort. Yes, Cadet. This system simulates real-world combat scenarios. It is vital to our training and strategic preparations. Richard looked at the simulation, unimpressed. So, you guys fight holograms? Is that what all the fuss is about? Evar's voice cracked slightly, a rare moment of vulnerability for the usually stoic commander. It is far more complex than you understand. These holograms are not mere images. They are simulations that adapt to your every move, learn from your tactics. We have the most sophisticated weaponry in the galaxy, and we train with the utmost precision. Cool. Can I get a sample of that? For, personal research? Richard asked, suddenly more interested in the weapon displays. The Bricker general froze, visibly unnerved by the casualness of Richard's tone. "What kind of research?" "Just some notes," Richard replied, already pulling out a small data pad. "See, back on Earth, I'm kind of into brewing stuff, alcoholic beverages and all that. I've got this theory that some of your weapons could be, I don't know, great for fermentation. Like the way they break things down into smaller components? That's totally a brewing method. I bet I could figure out a way to—" "No, Cadet," General Evar interrupted, his voice rising in alarm. "Our weapons are not to be used in any capacity other than for combat. You are here to learn how to fight, not brew drinks." Richard waved him off. Sure. Just saying, though. Could be interesting. Maybe we'll get to it after training or something." The general's body rippled with agitation as he led Richard through the rest of the facility, detailing the military protocols, weapon safety, and combat strategy. However, Richard seemed far more interested in the water filtration systems, the energy-efficient lighting, and, most surprisingly, the food dispensers in the corner of the hall. "So, this place is basically a fancy hotel, right?" Richard asked, munching on a snack. "I mean, you guys have everything set up. Real high-tech. But where's the room service?" General Evar's armor plates clanged together, his frustration now barely contained. "We are not here to discuss room service, Cadet. You are here to train with a bricker." Sure. I'm all in," Richard said, clearly not paying attention. "But I've got to say, the food here isn't bad at all. Kind of reminds me of a pub back home." Evar stopped, his entire form vibrating as his patience reached its limit. "Cadet Maxwell, if you do not take this seriously—" Whoa. Relax, General," Richard interrupted with a raised hand. "I've got it covered. You'll see. I'm going to crush it in training." Evar stared at him for a long moment, his facial tendrils quivering with stress. There was something about this human that unsettled him deeply. Richard's lack of discipline, his disinterest in the deadliest weapons known to their species, was not only unusual, it was dangerous. Yet, the Bricker High Command had insisted on this exchange, and now Evar was faced with the challenge of guiding this seemingly unserious cadet through the most important training of his life. At that moment, General Evar realized something. He was not only dealing with an unusual human, he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than he had first believed. The following days passed in a blur of alien training techniques, high-tech weaponry demonstrations, and Richard's ever-growing sense of detachment. While General Evar attempted to introduce Richard to various combat exercises, Richard seemed more interested in testing the limits of the facility's gravity systems or fiddling with its atmospheric controls. But something strange was happening. Despite his evident disinterest, Richard's seemingly random actions were yielding unexpected results. One day, as Richard wandered through the training grounds, he accidentally triggered a combat simulation, sending holographic Bricker soldiers into full battle mode. "Wait, this isn't part of the plan." General Evar's voice cracked through the comm system as Richard casually looked up from a nearby console, completely oblivious to the sudden outbreak of simulated warfare. "Well, that's inconvenient," Richard mumbled, scratching his head. "I didn't mean to do that. But hey, at least it's a good test run, right?" General Evar's sigh could be heard echoing across the facility. Cadet Maxwell, for the last time, stopped pressing random buttons. Richard ignored him, staring at the holographic Bricker soldiers as they advanced. It wasn't long before Richard realized something peculiar. Their movements mirrored his own. The simulation, it seemed, was learning from him, adapting to his lack of conventional strategy, his erratic movements, and his unorthodox thinking. "Well, this is unexpected," Richard said with a grin, slowly starting to pace in circles. The holographic Bricker soldiers followed suit, turning with him, their movements jerky and unpredictable. As Richard continued his strange dance, the holograms began to glitch. The once fierce soldiers now struggled to maintain any semblance of coordinated action. Some of them stumbled over their own feet, while others just stopped entirely, unsure of how to react. Richard, who had no clue about any of the combat mechanics, had somehow managed to outsmart the simulation purely through his chaotic unpredictability. General Evar, watching in stunned disbelief from the command center, could only stare at the chaos unfolding. This is not possible. The simulation is malfunctioning because of his unorthodox movements. But it's still working. Richard's eyes widened in mock surprise. Huh, looks like I'm winning. Who knew running around in circles could break a battle simulation? The simulation finally crashed, leaving the entire combat dome in a tense silence. Richard casually strolled over to the control panel, pressing a few buttons to shut it off. Okay, well, I'm going to call that a win, he said, looking back at the now deactivated holograms. What's next on the list? General Evar stormed into the room, his form bristling with barely contained fury. You destroyed the entire simulation. Do you realize the gravity of what you just did? Richard shrugged. Wasn't intentional. But hey, I can't help it if your system doesn't know how to handle a little creativity. At that moment, General Evar paused, his mandibles clicking together thoughtfully. He had expected Richard's presence to be a mere formality, something to placate the human diplomats. But after witnessing the way the simulation collapsed under Richard's sheer unpredictability, he began to wonder if there was something more to this cadet than met the eye. You may have disrupted the system, Evar began, his voice tinged with reluctance. But there was something else there. Something unorthodox, yes, but also effective. Richard tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. Wait, you're telling me that was actually a good thing? Evar nodded slowly. The Bricker have always relied on precision, control, and predictability. Your style, it's chaotic, but it's unpredictable. It doesn't follow the rules, and in some cases, that could be a tactical advantage. Richard's grin returned, and for the first time, a look of genuine interest appeared in his eyes. Wait, so you're saying I could teach you guys to break your own system? General Evar hesitated for a moment, the weight of his words pressing down on him. Perhaps, but that would require a different approach, one that the Bricker are not accustomed to. Are you ready to change the way we think about strategy? Richard leaned back in his chair, placing his feet on a nearby table. I'm always ready to try something new, but don't expect me to start acting like I know what I'm doing. That's not really my style. Evar's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of something resembling respect in them. Perhaps the future of the Bricker will not lie in perfection, but in adaptation. Maybe, Cadet Maxwell, you are the key to an evolution we never anticipated. Richard chuckled. I like the sound of that. But just so we're clear, I'm not joining your military. I'm just here to break things and see what happens. Evar stepped forward, his voice steady but uncertain. You will remain under our tutelage. Your unique approach may be the key to something much greater than either of us anticipated. Richard smirked. Well, let's see if you can keep up. I warn you, I'm pretty good at breaking things. And so, over the next few weeks, Richard continued to train with the Bricker, though, in truth, his training was more about breaking their carefully structured systems than learning from them. Under his unintentional guidance, the Bricker began to question the rigid foundations they had built their military upon. Richard's chaotic methods didn't follow any known playbook, but they forced the Bricker to think in new ways that might just prove to be more effective than their old methods. It wasn't long before the Bricker generals found themselves adopting some of Richard's more unconventional strategies. Training exercises became less predictable, more fluid, and surprisingly effective. The once immovable Bricker military began to evolve, adapting to the unpredictability that Richard brought with him. But even as he continued to teach the Bricker, Richard's mind was never far from his real passion, brewing. As strange as it was, he found himself spending more and more time experimenting with the complex alien technology, trying to figure out how to apply it to his brewing theories. The Valonian facility was a gold mine for someone with an eye for innovation. And while the Bricker were busy adapting their strategies, Richard had his own plans bubbling away in the background. One afternoon, after yet another training session, Richard sat down with a small, makeshift brewing setup he'd created out of the Bricker's environmental tech. He smiled to himself as he stared at the liquid swirling in the container, a strange concoction of alien ingredients, now bubbling with life. It wasn't quite like any brew he had made on Earth, but it was something new, something unique. As the liquid simmered, he couldn't help but feel that this bizarre blend of human creativity and bricker innovation might just be the future of intergalactic cooperation. Maybe, just maybe, chaos was the key to bringing order to the galaxy. Now, if only I could figure out how to bottle this, Richard muttered to himself, watching the concoction fizz. That would be one hell of a business model. General Evar entered the room, glancing at the brewing setup with a raised brow. What is this now? Richard looked up with a grin. Just a little side project. No big deal. Richard laughed. No promises, General. But I gotta say, the Valonian technology has some real potential. You guys might want to rethink your entire approach to weapons. Maybe start with fermentation. The general sighed deeply, the weight of his role as a military leader clearly weighing on him. Cadet Maxwell, you are impossible. Yup, that's me, Richard replied with a wink. But I have to admit, I'm kind of enjoying the challenge. As Richard continued his brewing experiments and his unintentional military training, it became clear that while the Bricker were learning from him, he was learning something too. The unpredictability of life, chaotic, messy, and often frustrating, had its own unique power. And Richard Maxwell, the most unlikely cadet in the galaxy, was about to prove just how valuable that power could be. As Richard continued his brewing experiments and his unintentional military training, it became clear that while the Bricker were learning from him, he was learning something too. The unpredictability of life, chaotic, messy, and often frustrating, had its own unique power. And Richard Maxwell, the most unlikely cadet in the galaxy, was about to prove just how valuable that power could be. Day 18, the diplomatic incident. It was supposed to be a simple exercise, a mock diplomacy simulation between the Bricker and the alien species known as the Zelrothi, a race of lizard-like beings known for their extreme politeness and a cultural obsession with fermented seaweed. General Apo had arranged for a holographic envoy of Zelrothi diplomats to test the Bricker cadets' negotiation tactics. The goal? To de-escalate a fictional trade dispute over asteroid mining rights. Enter Richard Maxwell, once again late, mildly hungover, and holding a jar of something bubbling ominously. I brought a gift, he announced, walking directly into the negotiation chamber, completely unaware that it had already begun. Apo immediately snapped to attention. Cadet Maxwell, this is a diplomatic. Richard placed the jar on the table. Homemade Kel vodka. I figured if we're talking trade, why not sweeten the deal with some liquid diplomacy? The holographic Zelrothi ambassador blinked. You honor us with fermented plant matter? Richard nodded solemnly. And just a hint of battery acid. It really opens up the palate. What followed was an hour of confused conversation, half-imagined customs, and Richard accidentally inventing 3 entirely new diplomatic protocols, none of which made sense, but all of which were received as profound gestures by the simulated Zelrothi. Apo, arms crossed, jaw clenched, watched as the negotiations concluded in a treaty that included a clause for bi-monthly mandatory sauna sessions and a shared galactic cheese wheel. How? Apo asked later. Did that count as successful diplomacy? Richard shrugged. No one got vaporized. That's what I call a win. Day 20, the flight exam. It was bound to happen eventually. Maxwell in the cockpit. General Apo had fought this moment for as long as possible, citing things like safety regulations and galactic peace. But the curriculum demanded every cadet at least attempt a basic piloting trial. And so Richard found himself seated at the controls of a Bricker assault scout, flashing lights, dials he didn't recognize, and a navigation system that mostly screamed at him. All right, said the flight instructor over comms, simple test. Take her around the asteroid field, avoid collisions, and land on the training pad. No weapons. No problem, Richard replied. I'll just pretend it's like riding a drunk moose. You've done that? Technically, yes. The ship launched. Immediately, alarms blared. Richard's approach to flying could best be described as jazz. Improvised, chaotic, deeply alarming. He swerved around asteroids not with precision, but by sheer accident. He triggered barrel rolls he didn't intend and used the ship's emergency fire suppression system as a means of propulsion. Completely unnecessary, but stylish. Meanwhile, Apo watched from the command deck with the expression of a man watching a puppy try to defuse a nuclear bomb. And then, somehow, impossibly, Richard landed the ship. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't pretty. The ship made a sound like a dying walrus. But it was intact. The instructor was silent for a moment. That was the worst flying I've ever seen. But did I die, though? Richard asked, stepping out and immediately tripping on his own foot. No, the instructor admitted. But I feel like I did. Day 23. The engine room fiasco. There are few things more dangerous than a half-board cadet with access to a military-grade engine core in a dream. Richard's dream? To repurpose the plasma core's exhaust heat to rapidly age his new batch of blueberry stout. Controlled thermal fermentation, he explained to a very tired-looking maintenance officer. It's science. You wouldn't understand. You're fermenting beer on top of the plasma manifold. It's efficient and dangerous. Like me. 2 hours later, half the lower decks had to be evacuated due to what was officially labeled as mild heat distortion and unofficially referred to as the spicy ale incident. Apo arrived personally this time. Richard, he said slowly, as emergency crews sprinted behind him with glowing coolant rods, what did I tell you about touching things labeled "do not touch"? Technically, Richard replied, it said do not touch unless authorized. And I authorized myself. I'm going to scream. Do it. It's therapeutic. Day 25. The inspection. A high-ranking Bricker inspector was scheduled to visit the academy for a surprise review. Everything had to be perfect. Uniforms were pressed. Hallways cleaned. Cadets drilled. And Richard? He had converted the mess hall into what he called a Britopia lounge, complete with bean bags, mood lighting, and a new drink menu featuring things like Quantum Mule and Nebulous Sunrise. Apo nearly had an aneurysm. Maxwell, this is a military academy, not a cantina. But morale is up 47%, according to the numbers I made up just now. The inspector, a stoic four-eyed Bricker with the posture of a marble statue, walked into the lounge. Everyone froze. He walked slowly through the room, took a drink, sniffed it, sipped, then sat in a bean bag and said, "This is quite relaxing." Richard winked at Apo. Apo's eye twitched so hard he had to reboot his retinal implant. Day 28, the revelation. It was late. Most of the cadets were asleep. The corridors were quiet except for the soft hum of the ship's engines and the occasional thud of someone dropping a protein bar in their bunk. Richard was on the observation deck, staring out at the stars, a flask in hand. General Apo joined him. Couldn't sleep? Apo asked. Nah, too many ideas bouncing around. Apo stayed silent for a moment. You've caused more disruption in a month than some cadets do in their entire careers. Thanks, I think. And yet, Apo continued, the other cadets are more adaptable. Morale is higher. Even the instructors tolerate more. It's like your chaos has made them stronger. Richard smiled. Funny thing about chaos. It doesn't destroy things. It just shakes them up until the weak bits fall off. Then you see what's really solid. They stood in silence a moment longer. Also, Richard added, I may have accidentally invented a sentient beer. It's learning to whistle. Apo sighed. Of course it is. Day 30, the War Games. The Bricker War Games were a grand event. A simulated conflict on a vast planetary terrain, with cadets split into teams, outfitted with non-lethal weapons, drones, mech suits, and for some reason, a competitive marching band division. It was meant to test tactical thinking, leadership, and teamwork under pressure. Richard was assigned the role of squad leader for Blue Team. The logic behind this assignment was unclear. Perhaps Apo had lost a bet. Standing in front of his team, which included several of the Academy's most nervous recruits, Richard drew a tactical map in the dirt using a breadstick he brought for inspiration. All right, he said, standard military tactics won't work here. One of the cadets frowned. Why not? Because I don't know any. He pointed at a series of X's on the map. Here's where we don't go. That's too obvious. Here's where we pretend to go. That's where they'll think we are. And here's where we actually go. Through the swampy bits, dressed as migrating leaf birds. We're dressing as birds? I've already started molting, Richard said, peeling off his uniform jacket to reveal feathers he'd hot glued onto a flight suit. Apo, watching from the command tower, turned to his second-in-command. Is it too late to resign from the galaxy? The War Games mid-event. Somehow Richard's plan worked. The other teams were so confused by the sudden appearance of bird-clad intruders chirping nonsense and flapping wildly that they called for a full retreat. Using the chaos as cover, Richard and his squad seized the enemy's data core, delivered it to HQ, and, just for fun, set up a small lounge area in the enemy's command post, complete with foldable chairs and chilled drinks. When the simulation ended, Blue Team had won. Apo nearly deleted the results from the system out of spite. But rules were rules. Maxwell's tactics, technically, qualified as asymmetric engagement methodology. He would never admit it, but Apo was beginning to see something horrifyingly close to potential. Day 33, the promotion. It started with a call from High Command. Apo entered the training hall in silence, holding a datapad with official insignias blinking at the top. Richard was doing push-ups in the center of the room, which meant laying on the floor, grunting theatrically, and occasionally flexing when someone walked by. "Cadet Maxwell," Apo said, voice flat. Richard rolled over. "That's me, boss. You've been promoted." Richard blinked. "Like to what?" "Chief Party Officer." "No," Apo sighed. "Junior Tactics Consultant." "Apparently, someone in high command thinks your nonlinear strategy deserves observation." "Wait, this is a real thing? Like I get a badge?" Apo handed over the datapad. Richard looked at it. "Oh, hell yeah. Do I get a hat too?" "No hat. What if I make a hat?" Apo stared at him. "Got it," Richard said quickly. "Unofficial hat. No photos." Day 36, the interview. A documentary crew from the Galactic Training Network arrived to do a piece on new methods in military education. They wanted to interview the most unorthodox success story of the year. That, of course, meant Richard. The interviewer was a polished Tuvian with a sparkling exosuit and an ever-present smile. "Cadet Maxwell, what's the secret to your unconventional success?" Richard leaned back, arms crossed, sipping a mug of something bright orange and faintly humming. "The trick is simple. I just assume no one knows what they're doing, including me, and act accordingly. That's it. Well, that and never trust a species that doesn't dance." Behind him, Apo stood silently mouthing, "Why is this being broadcast?" Day 38, the crisis. Then came the moment everything changed. An actual emergency. A rogue AI drone swarm had escaped from a Black Ops testing facility on a nearby moon and was en route to the Academy. Hundreds of attack drones, self-replicating, fast, and designed to adapt to standard Bricker tactics. Everyone scrambled. Alarms blared. Weapons deployed. Apo took command instantly. Evacuate the lower wings. Defensive turrets on standby. Prep all squads. In the chaos, Richard walked calmly into the command center, holding a strange device. "What is that?" Apo demanded. "It's a transmitter. I've been using it to control the brewery's fermentation cycle. But I've also been feeding it sound loops of my voice, some classical music, and a few hours of aggressive bird mating calls." "Why?" "In case I ever needed to distract an army of rogue drones with something weird and unpredictable." Apo opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "Activate it." The drones arrived. They were swift, metallic, and deadly. But the moment they picked up Richard's signal, chaotic sound, nonsense logic, and echoing laughter, they paused. Then jittered. Then, one by one, began to spin in circles, flash pink, and recite Shakespearean sonnets in binary. It wasn't perfect. Some drones had to be manually taken out by the defense squads. But the attack was halted. Richard Maxwell, accidental war hero. Day 40, the commendation. The Academy held a ceremony. Formal uniforms. Medals. Speeches. Richard wore a tuxedo t-shirt and sunglasses. Apo gave the speech. To Cadet Maxwell, he said, each word visibly costing him, whose unconventional methods have repeatedly saved us, challenged us, and occasionally made us question the nature of causality itself. The audience applauded. Richard gave a thumbs up and held up a mug of Glorp ale. To weirdness. Day 43, the Advisory Council. The events of the drone crisis hadn't just earned Richard a commendation. They earned him something far more dangerous. Attention. 1 week later, Apo summoned Richard to an ornate hall deep within the Academy's administrative wing. Richard arrived late, dragging a wheeled keg behind him labeled Batch 7.1, Experimental. May cause memories. Inside, a circle of high-ranking Bricker officials sat in judgment, each draped in ceremonial armor that somehow looked both highly prestigious and deeply uncomfortable. This, Apo said grimly, gesturing toward Richard, is our new junior tactics consultant. Richard waved. Hey gang, who wants a drink? No one responded. One council member hissed. Another leaned forward. We have summoned you, Cadet Maxwell, to assist in recalibrating strategic projections for the Sargon frontier. Intelligence reports suggest an emerging insurgency, hostile, unpredictable, and completely resistant to conventional responses. Richard blinked. So, you want me to be your weird? A pause. That is one way to phrase it, the counselor admitted. Richard set down his keg. Okay, let me see the maps, the mission specs, and a stress ball. I work best when I'm squishing something. Apo, standing in the corner, muttered, I should have retired last century. Hours passed. Richard covered the once pristine strategy table with doodles, scribbled notes, and a napkin labeled Plan B, Laser Possum Distraction Protocol. At first, the council had looked on in horror. But then, interest, curiosity, even a spark of excitement. Wait, one said, peering at Richard's spiraling chart. You're using chaotic pressure modeling with adaptive feints and morale-baiting illusions? I call it the pizza box gambit, Richard said, holding up a sketch of a pizza box that was actually a drone decoy rigged to play party music and release glitter. It's confusing, unpredictable, and just weird enough to force hesitation. Silence. Then another counselor whispered, it might work. Day 45, Richard's office. They gave him an office. Big mistake. It took Richard less than a day to convert it into a brewing lab / tactics simulator / arcade lounge. One corner featured a pinball machine modified to shoot espresso shots. Another was entirely occupied by a towering fermentation tank named Susan. His desk was buried under hollow projectors, snack wrappers, and something that looked like an alien lava lamp with opinions. Apo entered, took one look around, and immediately reached for whatever organ Bricker used to process stress. You've turned a Class 2 command center into a dive bar. Correction, Richard said, sliding over in a hover chair made from old jet bike parts, a tactical dive bar. He pressed a button. A wall panel flipped open to reveal a three-dimensional battle simulator made of drones, neon string, and what might have been jelly beans. I call it the Chaos Theater. Apo looked at him with hollow eyes. Why do you name things? Because it makes them feel special. Day 46, Surprise Evaluation. Unbeknownst to Richard, a surprise evaluation team from High Command was dispatched to observe his methods in action. Richard didn't know because he was holding a mid-morning morale mixer involving hot sauce roulette and a game called Who Can Yell Strategy Buzzwords the Loudest while riding a hover scooter. The evaluation team arrived just in time to see Richard speed past shouting, force multiplication, before launching himself through a hoop of fire and landing in a beanbag chair with tactical grace. The lead evaluator blinked. Is this part of training exercise? Apo appeared, deadpan. No, this is the training exercise. They followed Richard through a whirlwind tour of his chaos-driven command style. He used board games to teach fleet maneuvers, karaoke competitions to determine leadership potential, and a random insult generator to test emotional resilience. Somehow, it all worked. Cadets under Richard's guidance were improving faster. They adapted better. They thought differently. The lead evaluator closed his report with a single sentence. Promising. Dangerous. Needs supervision. Day 48, the diplomatic visit. A delegation from the Androxan Union, a race of highly formal, emotionless insectoids, arrived for a tour of the academy. They represented a potential new ally in the war effort. Everything had to be perfect. Richard was put on a strict, do not interact with the delegation order. Naturally, he interpreted this as a challenge. When the Androxans were led through the cultural wing, they were greeted not by formal displays of bricker tradition, but by Richard, dressed in a full tuxedo made of duct tape, performing jazz flute solos in front of a wall made entirely of bouncing holographic memes. "This," Richard said smoothly, "is art." The Androxans stared, antennae twitching. Then one said, "Curious, you utilize absurdity as a weapon." "Efficient." Another scribbled notes, study subject, tactical clown, philosophy. By the end of the tour, the Androxans had requested 3 strategy briefings directly from Richard and invited him to their next diplomatic summit. Apo, holding his head in his hands, simply muttered, "Of course they did." Day 50, late night again. The academy was quiet. Richard sat alone atop the central tower, looking out over the training grounds. His brewing mug steamed in the cool air. For once, no alarms, no chaos, just stars. Apo joined him, silent at first. The old general rarely allowed himself rest, but something about these moments, these strange, quiet pauses in a hurricane of absurdity, brought him peace. Richard passed him a drink. "Tastes like burnt sunshine and regret." Apo sipped. Surprisingly tolerable. They sat there, not as soldier and cadet, not even as alien and human, but as 2 exhausted minds orbiting the same strange truth. War was madness. Peace was fragile. But somewhere between the two was something they could build, chaotic, improvised, and unmistakably real. Richard leaned back. "Think they'll ever take me seriously?" Apo looked at him. "You've saved lives, forged alliances, and redefined what it means to be a soldier. So no, not a chance." Richard smiled. "Good." Day 51, Maxwell's unofficial war games. The idea started with a sandwich. Richard had been mid-bite into what he dubbed a triple gravity meat spiral when he glanced across the mess hall and muttered, "You know what this place needs? A fake war." Within 24 hours, the academy was split into 2 factions, battle lines drawn with duct tape and spaghetti noodles, and every cadet conscripted into what Richard called the Glorpian insurrection simulation. There were rules. Kind of. Points were earned through unconventional means, like successfully infiltrating the enemy camp dressed as a snack cart, or convincing the other team that your unit was actually a musical ensemble. One squad launched a successful surprise attack using nothing but holographic pigeons and a slideshow of very convincing fake news. Apo had approved none of it. He discovered the war when a cadet burst into his office covered in glitter, saluting with a glow stick, shouting, requesting reinforcements. The karaoke outpost has fallen. Apo followed the chaos back to its source. Richard, sitting on a throne of beanbags in the center of a makeshift command tent made of tablecloths, looked up at the general like a kid who'd just invented fire, given his skateboard. "You're going to shut this down, right?" Apo asked flatly. "Nah," Richard said. "I'm going to escalate it." He then pulled out a megaphone and declared, "Midnight capture the brew station is now active." Apo walked away, slowly, deliberately, with the look of someone rehearsing how to explain all of this to a military tribunal. Day 53, the promotion. It wasn't official, at least not in the traditional sense. There was no ceremony, no badge, no fanfare, but a memo circulated. Quiet, careful, and signed by someone high enough that it mattered. Richard Maxwell, reclassified to Special Operative Advisory Class. Direct report to General Apo. Clearance updated. Status, probationary anomaly. He found out while attempting to siphon power from a vending machine to charge his espresso launcher. "Hey, neat," he said, looking at the datapad. "Guess I'm someone now." Apo, watching from the shadows with a deep sigh, muttered, "He's always been someone. That's the problem." Day 54, the field test. They sent Richard on an actual mission. Not a simulation, not a drill, a real field op. Apo fought the decision hard. But Central Command insisted. Richard's tactics had proven viable in simulations, and now they wanted proof. The mission was simple in theory. Extract a stranded Bricker intelligence officer from the collapsed ruins of an ancient station on the moon Hasker 4. Of course, nothing with Richard was ever simple. His extraction team consisted of one ex-cook named Marn with a flamethrower, a malfunctioning medical drone that only dispensed confetti, and a sentient mushroom named Kyle. Upon arrival, Richard assessed the terrain, scratched his chin thoughtfully, and said, "We're going to need more balloons." By some eldritch miracle, they pulled it off. Richard used a combination of improvised theater, unexpected laser pointers, and fermented gas clouds to disorient the pirate squatters occupying the ruins. The officer was extracted unharmed. The mission report read, "Objective complete. Methods inadvisable. Recommend deep psychological evaluation." Richard framed the report and hung it above Susan, his fermentation tank. Day 56, intervention. Apo called an emergency meeting. He sat Richard down in the strategy room, alone. No audience. No chaos. Just them. "You're becoming a symbol," Apo said, arms crossed. "Not just here. Across the fleet. Other outposts are asking for your input. Command is considering replicating your program." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You say that like it's a bad thing." Apo leaned forward, voice heavy. "Because it might be. You're brilliant in your own impossible way. But you're unpredictable. You're you. And war isn't kind to outliers." Richard swirled his mug of spicy blue tea. "Yeah, but maybe it should be." Apo was silent. "Then, if this goes wrong, they'll blame you. And me." Richard looked up. "So why keep backing me?" Apo stood, heading toward the door. "Because you remind me what it feels like to hope." Date 59, classified debriefing. Richard found himself summoned again, this time to a blacked-out room beneath the academy. No lights, no identifiers. Just a single chair and a projection screen. On it, a video played, distorted footage of a world falling apart. Ships burning, planets fragmenting. A symbol flashed at the end, one Richard didn't recognize. A voice, cold and metallic, echoed from the shadows. "We are approaching an end. Chaos will not be an accident. It will be the weapon." Then silence. The lights came on. Apo stood in the corner. "That's the threat," he said grimly. "It doesn't play by rules. Doesn't want peace or conquest. Just entropy. Living, thinking entropy." Richard blinked. "And you think I can help stop it?" "No," Apo said. "I think you might be the only one weird enough to outmaneuver it." Day 60, Richard's decision. He sat alone that night. The academy buzzed in the distance. Simulations. Cadets. The usual hum of preparation. Richard stared at the stars. He didn't ask for any of this. Never wanted it. He came here chasing booze and boredom, not destiny and destruction. But somewhere between the laser possums and diplomatic jazz flute solos, he'd become something. Not a hero, not a soldier, but a force. He stood, tossed back the last of his brew, and whispered to the night, "All right, Void, let's dance." Day 61. Operation, subtle as a brick. The plan was infiltration, which, in Richard's mind, translated roughly to loud distraction with optional stealth if anyone remembers to bring a cloaking sheet. The target? A rogue Bricker weapons cache on the surface of asteroid D-772. Officially abandoned. Unofficially, crawling with black market salvagers and a self-aware vending machine named Zorp that had declared itself warlord. "Right," Richard said, pacing in front of his team, which included Kyle the Mushroom, the ex-cook Marn, the confetti drone, now renamed Dr. Sparkles, and two cadets who had absolutely no idea how they ended up there. "We need subtlety, precision, finesse," he said, while actively duct-taping fireworks to a broom. Apo, watching the feed from command, buried his face in his hands. "Why do we send him again?" one of the admirals asked. Apo didn't answer. He was too busy muttering, "At this point, I think we just let the storm ride itself out." Back on D-772, Richard initiated his grand diversion plan. He programmed Zorp to believe it had received a diplomatic letter from the Intergalactic Council of Beverage Distribution, offering a lifetime vending license in exchange for surrender. Zorp agreed. The cash was secured in 12 minutes. Richard returned with 6 crates of experimental plasma liqueur and a statue of himself carved from asteroid rock by an anonymous admirer, probably Kyle. Apple updated the mission status to Success, Don't Ask How. Day 63, Reality bends back. Something was off. It started when the cafeteria's soup began predicting the weather. Not metaphorically, it literally turned blue before storms, green during solar flares. Then Richard's brew tank began humming in binary. And on the 3rd day, a crack appeared in the sky. Not in the sky as in the atmosphere. No, in the concept of sky. A jagged, shimmering split that hung above the training grounds like a wound in reality. Apo stood next to Richard, both staring. That shouldn't be possible, Apo whispered. Richard shrugged. Reality's always been a bit dramatic. Sensors couldn't explain it. Scientists scrambled. Theories were thrown around like darts in a pub. And then came the message. Scrawled across the academy walls in glowing alien script no one recognized, except Richard. Because it wasn't alien. It was handwriting. His. You aren't ready. Stop brewing. They hear you. Day 65, Brew Storm Protocol. Emergency lockdown. The Bricker Council wanted Richard detained, interrogated, and possibly exorcised. Voidwalker Command overruled them. Barely. Instead, Richard was relocated to a containment chamber. Not a prison. More like a mobile lab/bunker. Nicknamed the Keg. Inside, he was ordered to cease brewing, cease theorizing, and most definitely cease talking to mushrooms that spoke in riddles. Naturally, he started a new brew that same night. Void's acting twitchy, Richard muttered, watching the stars ripple outside the Keg's viewport. Feels like something big's waking up. Or worse, getting thirsty. He added 3 drops of anti-gravity resin to the vat and grinned. We'll brew first contact before it brews us. Day 68, contact, sorta. The crack in the sky widened. From it emerged, not a ship, not a being, but a sound. A low, rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat slowed to planetary tempo. Everyone across the system felt it. Some cried. Others fell unconscious. Machines froze. Richard? He danced. Yup, he said, nodding in tune. That's the flavor. That's what's been missing from the brew. Kyle, now embedded in the side of the tank like a very opinionated ornament, blinked. You realize this could be the death of everything? Richard sipped from the tank. Nah, it's just the intro track. The album's gonna slap. Day 70, Operation, First Pour. Richard's brew, now semi-sentient, was named Reality Bach. It shimmered with unstable molecules and carried notes of cinnamon, coffee, and mild existential dread. Voidwalker Command had a choice. Try to destroy it, or try to use it. They voted barely and chose deployment. The plan was to launch the Reality Bach into the crack. Feed the unknown with something too unpredictable to devour cleanly. Richard loaded the tank himself, waved off the fleet, and whispered, "Cheers, you cosmic bastards." The launch went off perfectly. The crack shivered, shrunk, then snapped closed. And just like that, silence. Victory? Maybe. Peace. For now. But Richard knew better. The void hadn't closed. It had gulped. Day 72, Legacy Mode. He woke up to applause. The cadets. The brass. Even Apo clapped. A little. Richard was a hero. Again, the Academy threw a celebration. Speeches were made. Statues unveiled. Drinks flowed, all strictly below explosion grade, per regulation. But Richard? He didn't feel finished. Something was out there, drinking him in, learning, adapting. You feel that? He asked Apo, staring at the stars. Apo nodded. It's not over. Richard smiled. Good. Would have hated to peak early. He raised his mug, filled with a fresh batch. To the next crisis. May it be weirder than the last. Apo clinked his cup. Knowing you, it will be. If you were fascinated by the first part of this interesting adventure, make sure to subscribe to see Part 2 and find out what happens to Richard.